So we're good?
Yep. Yeah, certainly.
Awesome. Okay, so first, because this is, given the subject matter, I feel like there's a number of sort of preemptive things that I have to say, which is maybe the first, considering the political climate and how contentious it is, and that this is being recorded, it might behoove me to say that this does not represent Boston College officially. But beyond that, also acknowledging because when I did this project, of course, a lot of questions come up about, well, like, you're a white man, why are you writing about this? So I think it kind of, these areas of dealing with philosophy of race, that the intellectual labor should default onto white individuals and should not be thrust upon people of color. They already do far too much intellectual labor. Beyond that, a general outline, I'm going to start with, okay, we're using a lens of critical phenomenology, which obviously, maybe or maybe not obviously, comes from Husserl and his phenomenological movement. That's going to help us understand racialization, and then building on our understanding of racialization will help us to understand our need to reckon with whiteness as a category. This is just before we get really into the weeds of it. Some set dressing, these are some key terms, very rough sketch definitions. I don't know how many people are familiar with phenomenology, roughly. So this is a resource, I suppose, if anyone has any questions, we can always come back to this. However, the definitions I did pull from or adapt from a section in a book called 50 Concepts for Critical Phenomenology. And there are a few really solid quotes that I think just help set the stage for why we're doing critical phenomenology itself. So to begin with, Davis, who is the author of this first section, says on page 4, instead, phenomenological intentional consciousness is the relation itself, such that consciousness is always consciousness of something. Consciousness is not merely a know-or-known relation, but is also a being in the world or the flesh of the world. Now, for Husserl, this phenomenology as a method is meant to lead us towards the things themselves. However, and I think what Davis does aptly point out as being an issue, is that Husserl, and this is a quote, seems to be claiming at once that we are engaged within the world we live of lived experience, and that we are not a part of. Oh wow, okay, never mind. Just kidding. Let's see here. I just lost my place. Yet this apparent contradiction could also provide a way of showing the practical promise of an intersectional phenomenology. I'm sorry, looks like that quote got cut off. So when one takes the transcendental turn, the world keeps on turning. More specifically, Husserl stated that even though the phenomenological method involves a suspension of the general theses of the natural standpoint in favor of the phenomenological standpoint, the world of the natural standpoint is where it all takes place. Merleau-Ponty, again another quote, put it succinctly when he said that the most important lesson of the reduction is the impossibility of a complete reduction. Davis goes on to sort of draw some interesting observations with the German word for overlapping, Überschneidung, I think is how you would pronounce that. And so talks about how, okay, these are plate tectonics, teach us that when one plate slides over another, the results are anything but stable. One plate encroaches upon another, resulting in profound and widespread instability, such that we must mistrust the very ground upon which we stand. And that ground is not holy ground, and subjectivity is always subject to the structures it cares about and describes critically. Perhaps this manifests the spirit of intentionality to intend to care about that within which one appears as phenomena. Okay, so what I'm also going to do is I'm going to kind of go back and forth between reading the paper I wrote, just because think I explained it a lot more clear in the paper than I could sort of conjure up. But the first thing to focus on is just a very brief addressing of, okay, why critical phenomenology? Why is this needed to, debunk certain racial categories and to then reckon with whiteness? The first is that it connects implicit bias and racialization. Going back on that unstable ground that we exist on, and now we're trying to analyze that very ground, something like bias and something like race as categories, at least in the literature of critical phenomenology, comes up as being incredibly significant to the identity of the thinker who thinks thoughts. That will then lead us into clarifying racialized existence and then ultimately the impact on systems of oppression, because what's important to note is that critical phenomenology is not only a way of philosophizing, but it is also a way of engaging in political activism. And so there's a heavy focus on praxis within the tradition. Which leads us to our goal. So we want to understand, as we've kind of already did the groundwork, very roughly, the phenomenological method. More specifically, we start to see the historical realities of race come to surface and how we are racially situated as beings in the world. And then that ultimately is an understanding of the racial ideologies and biases that we have. Okay, so sort of jumping into this then, let me situate myself here. Okay, so the historical situatedness of racialized existence. Now, one of the things that inspired this, and actually this is for my undergraduate thesis, and I started working on this project after the murder of George Floyd. And one of the things that seemed to be highly problematic was the issue of we're not able to move forward because some of the language might be ambiguous or people don't agree. You'll hear someone say, well, how can all white people be racist? I just saw this video that was particularly inspiring for this, which was around the time of the Charlottesville riots, I think it was. And this one individual was at a park and he was really mad, and he was like, well, my family was too poor to own slaves. And I was just I don't know that is the response you want to give. I mean, I think maybe a good faith reading is hey, my family also faces systemic issues and didn't directly play into that. But then there's also the issue of okay, but then what if they didn't? What if you happened to be in a position where you had money? Would your family then have no issue taking up that colonial legacy of slavery? So what we're trying to do then is negotiating the racialization of beings with that natural attitude that Husserl presents to us, which is just our everyday walking in the world, not analyzing the structures of consciousness in the world around us, and then the extent to which those habits and norms are formed, broken down, and reformed. An article by Lopez puts this really great. It's a melting down, molding, shattering, and recasting of race. And that's sort of what this project is meant to do. And to sort of really set the scene for how it's historically embedded is that Chris Seeley, there's a quote, and it's that the past, my past, is never past, since it's always implicated in informing the present. Now, first of all, I think that that's just generally the case across the board, historically. And intersectionality offers a lot of really great perspectives on that, from not only from race, but gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, so on. And one other thing that's important to flesh out is when we're talking about bias and implicit bias, and what does that mean? The reality is that there are, at least, you could quantify into three categories of bias, right? The first one could be something like a positive bias, right? I have a bias towards protecting my life, okay? If there is someone who is acting radically or dangerously, I have sort of an internal, natural response to protect myself. And that's something that's informed us as we've been thrown into the world and we've experienced what it looks like to have to survive. The next is just sort of a banal bias, right? Like we develop preferences that are mundane, they don't really make a difference. Maybe I like chocolate, maybe I don't like chocolate, right? Maybe my favorite color is pink, maybe it's not pink. What we're really focusing on here is the problematic implicit bias, and that has to do with the development of stereotypes, race as such. And so those categories will hopefully become more clear. Go ahead and find Ryan in the paper. Okay. Perfect. So moving on to the issue of stereotypes, if this wants to go on to the next slide. Apologies. There we go. That's the slide I want. Okay. So stereotypes, I hope that we can all come to some understanding, are social constructs that do not necessarily reflect reality. And if we can't agree with that on the outset, hopefully that becomes clear by the end of the presentation. Something that's kind of shocking, and maybe that helps to sort of bring this to surface, is that, and this is kind of dated, right? It's 1990s, but I think still speaks volumes, especially in today's climate, which is that more than 50% of white Americans believe that Black Americans are more prone to violence than white Americans are prone to violence. And when you get into the literature of that, which I do have linked down below, Sharif Marco et al., from Measuring Everyday Racial and Ethnic Discrimination in Health Surveys, is kind of a terrifying notion, right? You have more than half of the dominant group within a country that thinks that the minority is more prone to violence. And so therefore, racialized stereotypes have as much of an influence on criminal justice professionals as non-professional jurors because of the deep entrenchment of implicit racial bias. As an effect, racialized stereotypes can be observed in the measurable increase in the probability of receiving a death sentence when defendants present as being more so-called stereotypically Black. And I'll go ahead and mention some more legal and medical issues to sort of ground, like this is great pie in the sky, we're talking about race and these concepts that maybe for some people seem kind of distant. But when you analyze very specific areas of society and you can connect it and say, hey, look, this is something that's tangible, this is an effect of an ideology or a belief or something that we're socially conditioned into, the results are, I think kind of grotesque, realistically, what it is. So in any case, racial formation takes place at the level of human interaction. Coming out of interaction, one might question in what capacity does the social history of a group influence white versus non-white categories. The question of so-called whiteness and to whom this mental schema applies is thickly situated in history. As the next section will flesh out, that there's an ambiguous nature to this category of whiteness, and I ask that you consider historic examples of ethnic groups shifting from being white to being non-white, and from being non-white to being white. Given the social embeddedness of racial formation, such constructs take place in the relation between beings. I'll bring you to my next slide. Okay, so this looks kind of confusing. The title of the slide is a complete mess. But what I'm saying here, and this isn't like an original thought by any means, this is just an observation in the literature, is that there has historically been a shift between individuals who at one point were considered white or almost white, and then they become other, from then individuals who started out in a positionality of being other, and then through some historical necessity, they are able to be appropriated into the white narrative and group. So specifically, two examples of that: 19th century Anglo-Americans' views on Mexicans at the time. So they shift to a prejudicial belief towards that the Mexican demographic in California and in the Southwest begins around the mid-1800s. You can reference California's Greaser Act. Now, on the Greaser Act, very briefly, this was essentially an pulling from Kaylee Berger's surveying the Golden State, 1850 to 2022, vagrancy, racial exclusion, sit, lie, and the right to exist in public. They say that this act allowed the state to force more vagrants into labor and wanting to protect honest people from the excess of vagabonds. On April 30th, 1855, an act to punish vagrants, vagabonds, and dangerous and suspicious persons. A year later, the legislature drops the word greaser from this as a way of trying to hide the racialized implications behind this. Let me find where I was here. Right. So then we go from that and we look at the appropriation of Irish immigrants into the category of whiteness. I mean, this is a common thing that's retort that's given by some people who, try to say, oh, well, white individuals experience racism. Well, look at the Irish, Irish need not apply signs. It's also the case, though, that when someone is taken up into the category of whiteness, there's a necessary erasure that takes place of a non-white identity so as to fit into the hegemonic narrative. And that in doing that, you kind of lose that sense of alterity because now you're perpetuating and benefiting off of the same category that at one point was oppressive to you. And so all of this is to lay out the groundwork to say that race as such is a social construct. And I'm trying to show that the reality is that if you can have individuals that span ethnic groups, that span geographical locations, switch and oscillate from being a part of the dominant culture to then suddenly not, well, there's a reason for that. It's because it's not based in something biological. It's not based in any historical account that's consistent in any meaningful way. And so to that end, go ahead and move on to the next slide here. The task at hand is one that deals with debunking race. And so we're looking at biologism and essentialism. From the okay, so my appeal here is to go ahead and try to say, first, right off the bat, there's no biological premise for something like race. Race is not the same thing as ethnicity, which a lot of people try to obfuscate. The belief that one drop of black blood determines an individual's race illustrates the relation between the historical and the biological. The one drop rule is a point of intersection. In the case of Metro Broadcasting versus the FCC, former Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia reaffirmed the court's understanding of race as being determined by an individual's blood, where he said something to the effect of, the blood that's in the blood, show me the blood. Okay. Centered around clarifying what qualities are innate in black individuals as a means to justify slavery, Hudgens v. Wright, which I believe was from the Virginia Supreme Court, explicates the historic belief that race is determined based upon morphologic characteristics. The court's decision to pronounce the appellees as being free from slavery was premised entirely on having hair which was long and straight. That supposedly these qualities are not innate in black individuals. These two court cases argue directly or tangentially, an individual's race is determined on a biological level. Skin pigmentation, as a biological view of race, is not given precedent in court. This lack of consistency in the court can be seen in the majority opinion in the 1922 case, Ozawa v. United States, where the court struck down the argument that a person's skin pigmentation is a determining factor in their race. Now, this, I'll keep going. I'll come back to that in a second. The belief that biology determines race is not lost to history. Consider as recent as 2016. Yeah, so this is particularly grotesque, and we'll have more medical examples that come up here. As recently as 2016, a study of white medical students found that half of the students interviewed believe that either, and let me switch to the next slide so you can see this, believe that either black people's nerve endings are less sensitive, or that their skin is thicker, or that their blood coagulates at a faster rate when compared to white people. This data suggests that the white medical students in the study appear to be misaligned with the broader scientific community. Given there exists more intra-group genetic variation than there exists intergroup genetic variation, biology does not determine race. It's pretty widely accepted now that there would be more genetic variation between myself and any other individual who's white than there necessarily would be between myself and any person of color. There's just no predicating factor that your skin pigmentation and the amount of melanin in it is determined on some sort of grand genetic scale. Now, some people want to go ahead and argue, well, what about when you look at different health conditions that disproportionately affect people of color? You can look at like heart disease and diabetes, for example. Well, the reality is, and what will become clear hopefully, is that these are not products of some sort of genetic biological marker for race, and that by somehow in your blackness you're more prone to your heart failing. The reality is that it boils down to socioeconomic issues, redlining, a lack of access to quality healthcare that's affordable that won't bankrupt you, and also a lack of privilege in that your healthcare provider will not engage in unethical practices against you, which we'll see later that the American Medical Association is particularly guilty of this. Okay, so moving on, the second conceptualization of race takes place not at the level of physical traits, but on some false belief in fundamental differences of being between races. This is racial essentialism. Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks gives us the capacity to speak of racial essentialism articulately. He says, quite so, the black is just as much a man as we are. It's not because he's black that he's less intelligent than we are. So Fanon brings to the foreground a belief that race is determined by some essential quality of someone's very being. He posits the question, is one an animal, bad, wicked, or ugly in their being black? There's a famous quote from Fanon that I probably won't repeat, but it's like, look, mama, a black person, okay? While the child in Fanon's writing is calling into focus a belief in the essentialness of blackness, one begins to wonder at what point racial bias becomes present. This takes form in questioning whether racial bias is an innate feature in our being, or if racial bias is taken up over time. So because of this, we have to question, when is it that we start developing these biases when we're operating in the world? This is taken from numerous studies, and we can see that in answering the question, at what stage of development do beings become racially biased, child psychologists posit that starting at 3 years old, children become susceptible to categorical social preferences and attitudes. It's normal, right? That's how we operate in the world. Then from 5 to 4 years old, children assign preferences to transient features as they are related to in-group features. So what we start seeing is an in-group versus an out-group narrative. You can see this on a playground, right? You can see how children play with each other, who's accepted, why they're accepted. Maybe they're wearing the newest, shoes that have lights that go, really fun, and then maybe someone else isn't. And it's a way of drawing up into categories. But implicit bias has not been shown to slowly emerge over a long period of time to learn of environmental regularities. No, instead, rather, It has been shown that 5 to 6-year-olds demonstrate adult-like levels of in-group bias. The trend of implicit bias continues to grow with the increase of age. Perhaps indicative of the deep-rootedness of colonial legacies is that Black American children, like their adult counterparts, do not fit within this correlation. This is something that is particularly seen amongst white children, or at least you can draw the conclusion it is lacking within children that come from the demographics of people of color. Black Americans have a higher likelihood of showing a preference for whites and lack problematic implicit racial bias, unlike whites. The positive relationship between implicit bias and a preference for whites has not been shown to be moderated by the child's own race. Larger than the individual, the dominant collective tends to favor or view positively its own group while projecting negative information onto the other group. Narratives told to children are indicative of the sociocultural variables which impact the development of children's attitudes and stereotypes. Naturally, there is more at play in the development of children's mental schemas beyond just race alone. But the extent to which race does impact the development of children, there is a positive relation between the increase of age and the increase of racial bias. As children continue to grow in developmental schema, what produces bias, children begin to utilize more racial criteria in their in-group, out-group determinations. This demonstrates how race and being racialized is not tacitly baked into the focus of our being. Rather, as beings come to take up the world thrust on them, their mental schema is shaped accordingly, thus producing bias based upon the impetus of the dominant narrative. In Charles Mill's rejection of race as being something that is metaphysical, on the grounds of viewing race as being a contingently deep reality, which frames the social world we inhabit, we can see how race is not an essential quality of being. Corroborating Mill's refutation, psychologists have provided studies showing children are not born racialized, that seeing beings with black skin does not necessitate having qualities or different qualities of being. If this is the case, one must ask the question, if racial presuppositions are not primordial, what can be done to undo the racialization of beings? Now we shift into, or we go into a paradigm shift and a calling for a reckoning. While the individual cannot wholly escape their being in the world, what can take place is a centering of the marginalized. Bell hooks is a source of inspiration in developing the praxis of reckoning with implicit racialization, as the task at hand is the destruction of the category of whiteness. Reckoning with implicit racialization is reliant on a critical reflexivity, as it produces a clearing upon which the white individual's horizon of awareness can be broadened. As horizons open, whites begin to see the complexity of selfhood as they peer out to the edge of the disclosed regions of their being. Whites come to observe the various dimensions of the selfhood the oppressed must occupy socially. Broadened horizons bring to focus differences between selfhood whites know and the multiple selfhoods known to those who are oppressed. Particularly, if you're interested in this, Mariana Ortega is absolutely phenomenal with this. She takes up Heidegger's work and she talks about being in between. You also have Lugonis and the different Latina feminist phenomenologists who talk about multiplicity of self and its ruptures and tears that take place. For whites, acknowledging the racialized assumptions of the white institution is the first stage in this praxis of liberation and the destruction of whiteness, which takes place in a historical context. While reflexivity is bound to the temporal effect, it is necessary if the white individual wants to call into question their attitudes and reposition themselves towards a dismantling of colonial legacies. This will bring me into this model that I have, which is the spectrum that kind of emerges here. So coming to know the artifice of race regarding those considered non-white, we can come to make the connection between whiteness as the social construct of race, and establishing this connection, what is brought to surface is the ambiguous determination of white from non-white. It's not biological. There's an inconsistency in the law, and it's not essential. As we are racialized beings, we are thrown into the world, which thrusts racialized assumptions back onto our being. Our being racialized is the result of racial schemas being thrust upon our being. As the world shapes consciousness, and of course then consciousness shapes the world that we're in, this figure is an attempt to try to explicate the relation between individuals and the collective when considering racialization versus something such as racism. At the level of the individual, one cannot simply escape their mode of being racialized, just as much as one is unable to fully escape any other mode of their being in the world. While the collective informs an individual's mode of being in the world, it is the individuals who form the collective. To clarify the spectrum between racialization and racism, we must recognize the lexical difference between racialization and racism as such. Charles Mills states, "It is not merely that racism, the natural biological hierarchy of races, is false. It is not merely that culture, psychology, and intergroup relations are far more convincingly explained on the basis of contingent histories than of natural racial traits. It is that the very categories used to identify races are significantly trans-world relative. Through the critical reflexivity produced by questioning the ontic comport of whiteness, we gain the ability to excavate these differences. And this takes place first through the racialized individual coming to make sense of the world that they are enmeshed within through conceptual frameworks premised on base as a mode of being. This is in our development and coming to know the world that we're thrown into. On the other hand, racism takes up the racialized framework that we all exist within. But it goes further in that it affirms the superiority of whiteness as a category. Both the individual and the collective are at minimum understood as being racialized. Societal structures and institutions formed by those operating within a racialized lens exist and function within the schema of race. To uphold the racist end of the spectrum does not equate to being explicit about such a worldview. Rather, just as racialization can be implicit and explicit, so too can racist ideologies. So all of this is just to say, there's an issue. This is coming back to the problem that we had of language, right? In many ways, this project is addressed towards white people. This is not giving a lecture to our brothers and sisters who are people of color. No. This is speaking to the white person who says, I disagree that all white people can be racist. And to that I say that is an incredibly lackluster response to something that deserves far more attention than you care to give it because of your own discomfort. The reality is that what we're speaking about is that you exist racially. You can't escape that narrative. So then what are we left to do? Well, that's where maybe we have some hope here. So our reckoning with whiteness. First we have to deconstruct it. In order to deconstruct it, we have to see the role of critical reflexivity. And to see the role of critical reflexivity, we have to see the importance of broadening our horizons of meaning. Deconstructing whiteness does not require an essence or fixed experience of whiteness, which is a concern for Sarah Ahmed, who speaks quite at length in this domain. Reckoning with implicit racialized presuppositions instead requires the dismantling of systems of oppression both as they exist at the institutional level and at the level of the individual. Upholding the white narrative, the U.S. justice system and medical establishment both operate as systems of oppression which allow us to put to work the paradigm which has developed. I'll provide some examples for that later. That's not just going to be some sort of an unfounded claim. Reflexivity allows whites to call into focus the choices they make, which aid in the reproduction of whiteness, in which Sarah Ahmed speaks of that whiteness has become a given through acts of repetition. It is the willful actions It is the willful actions, whether explicit or implicit, which bolster the foundations of whiteness temporally and spatially. In melting down these homogenizing systems, the emptiness of whiteness comes into focus. Whites must reckon with the issues of white guilt and erasure, whose focus is the recentering of whiteness. Moving beyond guilt and erasure allows for the productive process of overcoming implicit racial bias. Reckoning with one's racialization allows for the overcoming of the defensive reorientation of the white individual. This reorientation broadens individuals' horizons of awareness, or rather, horizon of awareness. Through this broadening, whites gain the capacity to engage in white allyship, allowing for whites to aid in the dismantling of colonial legacies. The issue, though, is that when individuals allow themselves to become paralyzed by guilt, rendered as lost and as unidentifiable through erasure, the white individual becomes ossified in their own inability to see past their subjective and racialized lived experience. Rather than providing space for non-whites to inhabit and express their existence as being outside of normative uniformity, the ontological expansiveness of whiteness thrusts guilt back onto the white individual as a means of obfuscating reorientation. The decentering of whiteness requires for whites to pull in their expansiveness, but as a means of avoiding erasure, whites re-center their own self into the dialogue. The guilt felt by the white individual is one dynamic in which whites preserve and in which whiteness preserves and reproduces itself. Unnecessary dimensions of guilt allow for the recentering of whiteness, repositioning whites as the victim of racialization rather than the perpetrators of racialization. Whites have an empathetic divide. Coming from a position of oppressor, the white individual does not know how to extend empathy past racialized lines. All of that's to say that no one's asking you to feel guilty. Like, no one is, reasonably is asking you to feel guilty for something you did not directly do. Now, if you do feel guilty, maybe that says something, but that also shouldn't get in the way of the actual question, and to constantly fall back on, oh, I feel bad, what should I do? Read a book, right? Do something. Stop making it everyone else's intellectual labor to tell you what you need to do, and take the onus of what needs to be done. White people reject race theories because of their inability to empathize with the lived experience of non-whites. The failure to empathize across racialized lines means whites struggle to see how the United States justice system and the medical establishment, as examples, are oppressive towards non-whites, but certainly are not the only areas within our society that are guilty of this. The implicit racial bias present in these systems is perpetuated if a reckoning does not take place at the level of the individual. Capital punishment, as an example, is not race neutral, as juries are never fully impartial and always carry with them certain problematic assumptions, whether implicit or explicit. And that's not even just, that statement doesn't even just have to be supporting this argument as such. I mean, that's just a general understanding of the way that we exist in the world. We always already carry with us our history, and it informs how we navigate our present. As is, blacks are overrepresented in the prison system. This is not some new statistic, of course. They are disproportionately represented in the prison demographics. This does not, however, necessitate that blacks commit crime at a higher rate. In cases where black people are being tried for the murder of a white person, the white male dominance effect suggests the likelihood of a death sentence is higher when juries have at least 5 white men compared to juries which had 4 or less white men, which has been shown to be mitigated by the presence of, are you surprised, black male jurors having to go ahead and take up the labor of actually engaging in an impartial justice system. Even worse, or maybe not worse, but equally as bad, black women are less likely to have their pain caused by, for example, uterine fibroids taken seriously. When uterine fibroids are taken seriously in Black women, and this is particularly disgusting, more extreme procedures are recommended at twice the rate than they are for white women. This often results in their sterilization. As a function of white guilt, either whites are paralyzed in their guilt as being an oppressor, or whites reject problems of race as a means of coping. Recentering whiteness, making itself the victim, and forcing the marginalized to care about white sensibilities is the result of white guilt and fear of erasure. Critically engaging with racialized presuppositions, which tacitly inform the actions of whites, reflexivity as a reckoning with whiteness produces a tear in the being of whites. This tear is something that you can maybe draw akin towards what Latina feminist phenomenologists speak about, the everyday ruptures and tears in their sense of being and their multiplicity as they navigate the world. And this is only something that's experienced a handful of times, maybe, in a white person's life, rather than your everyday existence. Whiteness comes to experience this tear in the being of whiteness produces a shattering in the foundation of white normativity. Whiteness comes to experience a collapse of meaning, resulting in the ontological suspension of whiteness. Being ontologically suspended creates a clearing for whites to examine how their actions reproduce whiteness as a category, allowing for them to reject white normativity as such. Rejecting white normativity does not allow the white person to view the world from outside of their whiteness, though as if we can have some sort of objective Archimedean standpoint that we can view out upon the world. But instead it allows them to become aware of this problematic bias which undergirds their very being in the world. This rejection brings whites back to the start of reflexivity. And I'll go to the next slide here. Consider the significance racialized implicit bias has on the individual, whether it be the judge, the prosecutor, a juror, or any member of the judiciary body. If white jurors recognized their racialized implicit bias and took up the process of reckoning with their racialization, we might come to bridge that empathetic divide and mitigate the white male dominance effect. When a white juror comes to their conclusion before formally issuing it, the white individual ought to critically analyze their verdict, asking why they are more likely to condemn blacks to death. Whites must probe the entirety of their argument. Attempting to bracket the racialized assumptions whites carry requires for whites to not allow guilt and fear of erasure to overcome that reflexivity. Otherwise, you're not engaging in the phenomenological project whatsoever, not even just in critical phenomenology, but in even just as what Husserl would describe as phenomenology. To actively take up the decentering of whiteness, whites must allow for this probing to bring to surface their implicit racial bias. What implicit racial bias exists, which drive whites to sentence a black murderer to death as opposed to a white murderer? Why is it that whites are more likely to believe that they are targeted based on their race and ethnic background than members who belong to other races and ethnicities? In questioning their motives, whites find themselves needing to either change their verdict, present a non-racialized argument for their proclivity towards capital punishment of blacks, which I don't think is possible, or they must accept that they are acting on racialized bias and racist ideology. The white individual in this instance probes their bias, which shatters their illusion of acting from a presuppositionalist standpoint and causes a collapse of the meaning of being white. Through this process, the white individual can continue to question whether the conclusions made are purely based on racialized bias. This praxis discloses the implicit nature of racialized bias, calling for white allies to also engage in a continual reckoning with their whiteness. This isn't something that ever stops. You don't just question it once and you're done. This is a constant questioning of the way of your being in the world as such. White allies must ask if making themselves an ally, and this is something that maybe some people don't realize, say, okay, I'll just become an ally and somehow I'm done with the work. No, why are you becoming an ally? Because the question then is, are you becoming an ally as a means of recentering yourself? An effect of white guilt, or if it is genuinely positioned as a willful taking up of the dismantling of white normativity. In a less abstracted sense, for the medical establishment, this reckoning is crucial. From curriculum development to medical practice, the institution must reckon with its whiteness and its white heritage. The establishment must ask why half of white medical students surveyed had false beliefs about the physiology of black people. Whites must ask why medical students have found black women have the highest maternal mortality rates, anywhere from 3 to 4 times the rate of maternal mortality compared to white women. Medical practitioners need to critically assess if the treatments they are prescribing are consistent across racial lines, as the evidence so far has shown an implicit racial bias in diagnosing and treating medical conditions. Additionally, and not unlike most other Western sociocultural institutions, the medical establishment must also consider who they honor. While many will argue it is possible to honor historical figures despite whatever unethical actions they may or may not partake in their life, the question is, can we honor them given those accomplishments and because of those accomplishments, and celebrate them because of the accomplishments of their unethical actions, which you might otherwise not celebrate them for? Consider, for instance, James Marion Sims, a 19th century surgeon and former president of the American Medical Association. Gynecological medicine has honored Sims as being fundamental to the advancement made in this specialty. Perhaps most disturbing is the connection some modern medical beliefs have to Sims, as he refused to give his so-called patients anesthesia, having believed pain tolerance was tied to race. Recall the earlier study of implicit racial bias in white medical students and why many white students held the belief that black people's nerve endings are not as sensitive. Given the medical gaslighting, there understandably is a deep mistrust of the medical establishment amongst black communities. This plays into, for instance, why do certain races seem to have a higher rate of heart disease? It's because they naturally have a distrust of the medical establishment, which has disenfranchised them and abused them historically. When critical reflexivity takes place within the medical establishment, the white narrative of the altruistic doctor breaks down. What remains is the shattered identity of a person whose being is calcified in whiteness and who falls prey to white normativity. So, to conclude, conceptualizing human existence as being racialized is historically situated and requires whites to reckon with their implicit racial bias. Biases based on race prove themselves to be problematic as they produce stigmatized social stereotypes, and stereotypes do not necessarily, as we've said before, reflect reality. Further, an attempt in deconstructing the metaphysics of the racial realist brought forth the examination of biologism and essentialism. The need to clarify the claims of racialized existence were contingent upon making a distinction between racialization and racism. From this, the spectrum emerged. Finally, having laid the groundwork for implicit racial bias, the praxis of reckoning through critical reflexivity was put to work. Reckoning with implicit racial bias broadens the horizons of white individuals. In order to deconstruct the normativity of whiteness, white individuals must undergo this reckoning as they are the collective upon which whiteness is reproduced and temporally projected. The reshaping of the collective alters the normative framework thrust upon future individuals. While this does not move humanity past a racialized existence into some sort of utopic post-racial world, the breaking down of the normativity of whiteness, however, does bend the arc of this moral universe towards justice. And that is the goal of this project. And questions?
So, our racialization is because of the historical circumstances that we enter into or are thrown into. It's not because of some biological reality or essential characteristics or attributes or anything. But you said that we can never escape being racialized. But if it's only a historical thing, I mean, it seems like it might be very difficult. But as opposed to being biological or essential, it seems like it would leave room for change where those two wouldn't. And so, does this critical reflection eventually, maybe a few generations down the line, if that critical reflection keeps up and pervades like at a societal level, is that going to open the door to like escape the racialization?
That's a really good question. So first, to clarify, our inability to escape our racialization, meaning to say at the level of the individual as they are at present, right? We've already been informed based off of a racialized experience. The concern I have with trying to say that we can move into a post-racial world is centered upon the fact that any of us who have children project onto our children our understanding of the reality of the world. Now, is it the case that this could become some sort of, in a discrete manner, it could continue to become less and less and less? Potentially. But to that extent, we're looking at a complete societal overhaul. And perhaps it's just given current events. I don't know the confidence I have in that. I think maybe it might be more akin to, if anyone is particularly familiar with mathematics, looking at an asymptote and never reaching its zero. You can continuously decrease the amount of racialization in the world. That's a definite possibility, but the extent to which you can fully remove it, I fear agreeing with, only because when we look at the constructed mental schemas, how do we escape that? And how do we explain our sense and understanding of the world to future generations when our language for the past several hundred years has already been bound up within that racialized existence? But that is a really important question. I mean, and I could totally be wrong. Like, absolutely could be wrong. That's just my general sense of it right now.
With that, so you also said at one point that the collective informs how the individual like perceives themselves in the world and everything, but the collective is made up of individuals. Mm-hmm. So it seems like for the collective to change, some of the individuals in the collective would have to change first. And so maybe on the societal level, we're never gonna fully remove racialization, but is it possible for certain individuals? But then you have the backwards influence of the collective influencing the individual, and so
I think maybe, because that's an important question. I think maybe for myself, I approach it from a position of, is it a matter of trying to recognize and be aware of this as I'm operating in the world, and is that a more realistic goal than me having this notion that I can fully remove that from myself? Mm-hmm. The concern that I have about saying that I can fully remove that about myself is that in doing that, I've stopped the process of being critically reflexive, and I become blind to the possibility.
Right. If you think you made the goal, then exactly. You don't have to keep up the work.
Yeah.
I have a question. So we saw in one of the first slides too, when speaking of stereotypes and other kinds of socially proponded stigmas or misconceptions, things like that, or attitudes that we might carry with us unconsciously or subconsciously. only for it to arise when certain dispositions, basically. Now, these dispositions are, of course, socially reinforced, socially embedded, and so on. It's not something that is capable of existing in isolation from that entire community that you're a part of, out of which you came, and so on. Now, my question is involving the relation between reality, this world in which we are into which we are thrown, and the subjects who are thrown into that world. So on the one hand, when it came to the definition of like a stereotype, for example, it was let's see, where was it here? It was I can't remember where I wrote it down, but it was yes. So they're socially constructed beliefs that do not necessarily reflect reality. Now, I'm assuming by the reality indicated by that word, it's not the reality as infused by social practices. It seems to rely upon a kind of not a normative conception of reality, but a simple matter of fact, strictly alogical, or excuse me, non-axiological, or simply I don't want to say scientific, because of course that's going to be saturated with norms and things like that.
Acultural.
Acultural, yeah, from a standpoint of nowhere, almost from a view from nowhere, and in order to, so for example, as Seth was saying, everyone that makes, so all of our lives our entire conscious life is saturated with judgment. Or one could even say that our entire conscious life is just one big judgment, where we're always trying to categorize things and recognize identities, differences, and so on, relations, and so on. Each of those judgments that we make is going to be from the standpoint of our lived experience, and that, of course, is informed, as he said, by our social upbringing, our histories, and it lives in the present with us and is always infusing our kind of, I don't want to say blinding us per se, because again that would presuppose this extrinsically related thing in itself, basically, this reality that our social practices and our thoughts and so on is either in conformity with or not. So it seems like on the one hand, the world is both void of all racialization. Now, by racialization here, I don't know if I'm using it in the same sense you are, but I'm using it in the sense of there being no determining factors, so not necessarily an identical factor, but a factor that has some influence in the, let me put it this way, let me backtrack a little bit, sorry, just to make it easier, I think for myself, is make things a bit clearer. So when we try to envision the goal of this process of a completely deconstructed conception of race and racialization and things like that, as well as whiteness, and we try to envision what the world would be like apart from such categories, similar to, let me ignore that for a second. If we try to visualize it apart from these categories and so on, that world that we envision would have to be, of course, envisioned from some perspective or another, and what that would be like, independently of that historical informing process. It seems like it would be caught up in those very things that are ex-hypothesized, like blinding us and so on. But yeah, so on the one hand, the world in which we're thrown in appears to be, on the one hand, void of this kind of racial categories, or if you, I don't even know if you want to call it a continuum, but at least some kind of nebulous. I mean, of course, we're all individuals and so on, but we're not isolated atoms. That's another thing too. We're not. But nevertheless, though, there's a continuity between all of us. And if this world is void of racialization, it seems also at the same time, though, it is saturated by it, because the world that we're thrown into is the world as experienced by us. So it's not this thing in itself that we're thrown into, that we would have no value-free access to. We have to access it from some kind of standpoint or another, and that standpoint is going to be informed by those historical practices and historical judgments and so on. It seems like the ideal that we're trying to get at is that thing in itself, but the thing in what this world is that we're saying, okay, these claims that we're making about certain things that they have no bearing in, they do not adequately reflect reality. What it seems like a danger. I mean, I totally, I really like your presentation. I thought your paper was fascinating. My question is, I'm worried about not a relativism per se, but for white people or people that are identify as white or whatever, taking the lead, I guess, in this, and to how would we have the right, I guess, in this case, to say what that ideal scenario would be like, or how, because again, our judgments are going to be clouded by that kind of stuff. So that's a whole ton of questions. Sorry.
No, they're good.
Yeah, but I'm just I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think first, when we're looking at whether, I think you point something out that's incredibly important. There's a question of, okay, how are we examining the thing it's in itself, if that thing in itself also is just like not objectively something that exists.
Mm.
But I think maybe, and this is probably a fault of my own within the language, and to clarify would be, humanity has a very keen and apt way of historically dividing into categories and cutting the world up into different groups in order to justify behaviors, right? In-group versus out-group is something you can trace back as far as written history goes. Look at the wars fought over religion, look at gender roles, all of these ways that we come to comport within the world. And the question is, in some regard, if there is or isn't a God, if you suppose for a second that there isn't a God, and you say, well, take for example the problem of religion, well, someone's informed by that. What's the thing in itself, if you could lend that to such an ambiguous term as religion? Yet at the same time, if the claims of religion just fall flat. Now that is just a presupposed scenario. I'm not necessarily saying I agree or disagree with that. But I think that part of what we see though is also, once we start to develop these mental schemas, we start to develop a way in which we understand the world, in a way that justifies our actions and behaviors. I think in many ways, we see that kind of becomes a part of us and ossifying us. And I think that when we look at the pre-adolescent studies, not to say that everything should come down to like, show me the data, but when we do look at that to ground it, we can say, what's going on within the human conception of consciousness that makes it such that we need to bracket into categories these various aspects of our existence, and why is it that we feel the need to form more sub-communities than one larger humanistic community? And I think part of that just comes from this primordial sense of what it means to be human and survive in the state of nature. I don't think that's escapable, but I do think, however, that when it comes to something like race, because it's been a mental schema that's been casted and thrown onto us, and in some sense you can discreetly begin to measure when these racialized differences come about, I think that to that end we can question, within this social construct, what is the thing in itself that is race, even if that in some sense happens to be sort of devoid of some sort of meaningful.
There's nothing in the world itself that
exactly
it picks out.
And so to that end, I'm going to be honest, I don't remember your very last question.
No worries. Yeah. No, I think that going off of what you just said, you actually touched upon something that I was going to touch on, but it has to do with this elimination or this deconstruction of certain kinds of categories and things like that. For example, like certain concepts like phlogiston or caloric or the luminiferous ether and things like that, or elan vital or whatever you want to call it. These certain concepts that have been crafted specifically for the purpose of explaining certain things that are later superseded by something else. They're either completely done away with, or in certain cases, for example, let's say, like from the atheist's perspective, the word God doesn't pick anything out of the world.
Yeah.
Nor does it pick out anything in the world that is simply misidentified as God. It's no different from like I don't know, a unicorn or something like that. There's nothing that has ever existed or will ever exist. There's no horse-like thing in the world that has a horn and so on that we call a unicorn, but is nothing like that. So in the case of these concepts that are done away with, like ether or caloric, whatever, they're always picking out a particular phenomenon in question. And the phenomenon in question is not itself created by the very assigning of the ascription of that phenomenon with a particular kind of label of sorts. It's similar to like if you want to think of like the morning star and the evening star, or Superman and Clark Kent, there's two different ways of describing the same thing. And someone can know a lot of things about Clark Kent, but not be able to not know certain things about Superman, let's say. If you say like, I don't know, like, Lois Lane knows who Clark Kent is, but doesn't know certain things about Superman and so on. In the case of these instances of race and things like that, it seems that on the one hand, we're not disembodied Cartesian egos and things like that. We have we're rooted in the world in a sense that does not render us all. We're not one person. Basically, we're not all the same. We have differences, but when it comes to the deconstruction and or superseding of the categories of race and things like that, or racial categories and so on, even if it be considered like a continuum still too, that's still kind of embedded within that same paradigm of sorts. What do you think will surpass it? Because on the one hand, there's that one might object and say, well, wouldn't that just be like the kind of colorblind view of things?
Sure.
And that itself would, certain people say, it just perpetuates a kind of it perpetuates the very thing that it professes to supersede or do away with. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's always really troubling. I mean, that's a question that I find myself grading up against. And I'm not sure that I'm going to have an entirely adequate answer. But I think that when we're talking about, for instance, when we have these conceptions like the ether, and we're talking about like maybe the pre-Socratics or then Aristotle, and then now within physics, I mean, if anything's named ether, it's just more like a nod towards those who came before, rather than like a real ontological category. That is a really good question, because then part of this also gets into the argument that some people try to peddle that says, well, if it's all made up, then why do people of color keep taking ownership of their blackness, or why are they proud of their blackness? It's like, well, I mean, I think in part it's because when you construct these mental schemas and you thrust them on people, and now they're in the world and they're operating, there's a sense of power in resistance, in taking up the categories and that in the world that is thrust on you as you're thrown into the giveness of the world. I think that you do get a sense of empowerment as a community. And so I think to that extent, the question that I have is, if we do try to come to a point of, can there be something which will supersede or replace this notion of race, even if that's just a complete removal of it? The worry that I have is, what is the next level of erasure that might cause? And what is our drive for needing some sort of normative model when it comes to this? Now, naturally, I think within philosophy, there's this inclination to say, well, I mean, if we can come up with something that's normative, that's good. But I think that part of that is then when we start getting into this whole like issue of, heterogeneity homogeneity, and we're saying, let's really focus in, and well, but then what's going to be the dominant narrative? Who's going to have to sacrifice or shuck part of their sense of identity and self in order to fit into this? Now, of course, the white supremacist could retort and say, yeah, but in order for me to fit into this narrative that you're prescribing, I have to do away with my white supremacy. And to that, I'd say, yeah, then you should. I mean, I just don't take any issue with being offensive in that regard. But, and to your later question of responsibility versus right, and the roles that people play, and what's the role of the white individual within this, I think that's a hard question, right? I think that, first of all, you're never going to come to a place where, it's not like asking one person of color, hey, is this good? That somehow then they can be representative of an entire group of people, and like, therefore your project is good. I think it's also just a matter of engaging in that reflexivity and really questioning and saying, well, what's the point of this, and why am I doing this? It doesn't seem entirely clear to me that if it's a matter of trying to tackle an issue of whiteness, that should be the intellectual labor of people who don't get to enjoy the privilege of whiteness. Rather, it seems that the people who employ on their being in the world on a daily basis the privileges of whiteness, whether explicit or implicit, whether you're cognizant of it or not, you still are taking up that category, and to that extent, I think that intellectual labor does befall you. But again, it's also in the way that you take it up, right? I mean, I suppose if I were to stand up here and say, I am the maybe summum bonum, and I am the, I've got this Archimedean point, and I can see things from this objective reality that no one else can. Everything I'm saying, is based off of work that other people have done. Everything, it's just an observation. And so to that extent, is the goal a matter of liberation? Is the goal about supporting diverse groups? Or is it a matter of recentering your own self to stay pertinent in the narrative? I think maybe that's how I would look at it. Because I don't think you're going to find one catch-all way to determine whether or not the project you're doing is kosher, so to speak. That's my sense of it.
Anyone else there? Well, I have some other stuff, but if anyone else wants to chime in the meantime.
You can go.
Okay, let's see here. So I think one of the things that you touched upon was, it's really the criterion of how are we to determine social construction from reality as such. It's similar to like Sarp's, like this being in itself.
Yeah.
Homogeneous blob, basically, that's strictly void of any kind of normative character or anything like that. It's strictly free from the divisions or the discriminations that we make in understanding it. It's simply there, independent of us. Of course, I'm not you know, I'm an idealist, so like the question of social reality and reality as such, like a thing in itself, it's always kind of makes me uneasy because on the one hand, it does seem to imply a kind of division between ourselves and reality, the way we understand reality from the object understood. Because when we judge, we're always judging from the standpoint of the way in which it comes to us, as the way in which we receive it. And of course, the way in which we receive it is already articulated by the ways in which we have so received it in the past and so on, as well as the ways in which other people have told us about it. Now, when we try to do away with certain categories and base it upon, okay, for example, there's no evidence of such and such a correspondence or an agreement between such certain prejudices people have and so on. Therefore, because it is not the case that there is such an agreement between these particular judgments and what is being judged, therefore, it ought to be done away with. What it seems to rely upon a kind of, on the one hand, it seems to be heavily focused on this very scientific understanding of what determines real and
Sure.
the merely socially constructed. That's another thing too. It doesn't treat them on a level. It treats them it privileges one over the other, and it's this. It seems to be relying upon, if we do that, if it was the case that there were such an agreement, let's say, like that, it was the case that these stereotypes do necessarily reflect or did reflect reality, then would that give, if we do view that as the arbiter of reality and norms, this reality that's studied by science, it can be discerned by simply tallying up certain statistics and so on, would that give the justification for the perpetuation of those stereotypes and so on? So it seems like, okay, because these stereotypes do not reflect reality, therefore they should not be followed. But does that imply that if they did so reflect reality, then they should be followed?
I don't think you have to frame it like that.
Well, then you would also have to add on to another thing, like you'd have to incorporate like some kind of already a pre-given notion of what we ought to do, I guess.
Well, maybe. I mean, everybody accepts that, driving on the right side of the road or stopping at stop signs, these are social constructs that don't correspond to some hard reality. But I don't think the claim, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the claim is we need to do away with them because they don't correspond to a hard reality, but we need to do away with them because of the negative consequences that they entail. Like stopping at a stop sign doesn't correspond to a hard reality, but we do it because it has good consequences. Getting away with it doesn't have to do with its correspondence to a reality, but the types of things that come out of it. But people might push back and say, well, we need to hold on to these because they correspond to a hard reality. And that's where you can say, no, that's not the case. You don't need to hold on to them for that reason because they don't actually correspond. But the whole getting away with to begin with, I think, is on the point of the consequences, not on the correspondence.
Yeah, I think that's, you said it absolutely succinctly. Just in that, the focus here is, and I want to clarify, I definitely grounded this in a lot of sociological research, and the goal isn't to say that somehow that should supersede the project of philosophy external, some sort of hard empiricism, or soft empiricism, if I guess this is soft science. But it's to say that, well, because for instance, if, as we say, like the medical industry, for example, has been prone and is guilty of the same issues. So is science historically, right? But then it's a question of saying, so I wouldn't want to say that that should be the only determining factor. But then I do think, as Seth was able to sort of explicate really nicely, is that the reality is that we see very real consequences. So even though it's the case that science might also be riddled with this racialization, we can also see through some sort of a measuring the negative consequences and impacts it's having, and on a grotesque scale. And like, they're not just like minute issues, you know, like, oh, I don't get my favorite flavor of Pop-Tarts, or something just like so arbitrary, right? It's like very serious things, in some instances leading to death or sterilization. And I think to that regard, it's like, yeah, we need to look at the consequences for what they are. And as a side note, you can't retort with it's real. And so consequences be damned. Because this, to me, it doesn't come down explicitly to like a consequentialist perspective, right? Versus, you know, some sort of like a deontological situation. No, it's kind of like beyond that in some regards. It's like, yeah, I mean, there are consequences that are grotesque. And in both senses, you should get rid of the category. As much as you can. That's a very loaded statement, getting rid of the category. That's yeah.
Critically examining the category.
Exactly. That's a better way of putting it. Critically examining the category is, yeah. Sweet.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great presentation.